Captain Addison Scott was flying routine reconnaissance over the disputed Wakhan Corridor when her radar lit up like a Christmas tree. 3 MiG-29 fighter jets were vectoring toward her AH-64 Apache at Mach 1.2, their intention crystal clear: eliminate the American helicopter before it could report their position. The Wakhan Corridor was a narrow strip of mountainous terrain where 3 countries met, but none claimed full authority, making it perfect for covert operations and illegal arms trafficking. Standard doctrine said an Apache couldn't survive air-to-air combat with fighter jets. The speed differential was impossible, the weapons mismatch was absurd, and no helicopter pilot in military history had ever successfully engaged multiple fighter aircraft simultaneously. But Addison Scott wasn't standard anything. As the lead MiG fired its first air-to-air missile, she did something that would rewrite combat aviation manuals forever. The Wakhan Corridor stretched like a finger of land between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China, a remote mountainous region where borders blurred and sovereignty was more theory than practice. At its narrowest point, the corridor was barely 10 miles wide, but it extended for nearly 200 miles through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Peaks rising over 20,000 feet created a natural maze that had been used by smugglers, arms dealers, and terrorist organizations for decades. Captain Addison Scott, 29 years old, had been flying Apache attack helicopters for the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment for 6 years. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with blonde hair pulled back in regulation style and ice blue eyes that missed nothing, she was one of only 12 female Apache pilots in the entire U.S. military. What set her apart wasn't just her gender. It was her unconventional background and the flying skills that had earned her the call sign Viper. The Apache AH-64 was a masterpiece of combat engineering, a twin-engine attack helicopter designed to destroy tanks, armored vehicles, and enemy personnel with devastating precision. Armed with a 30mm chain gun, Hellfire missiles, and 70mm rockets, it was one of the most feared weapon systems on any battlefield. But it was also designed for ground attack missions, not air-to-air combat against supersonic fighter jets. Addison's current mission in the Wakhan Corridor was officially classified as reconnaissance and surveillance, intelligence gathering about suspected arms trafficking routes being used to supply weapons to terrorist organizations throughout Central Asia. Her Apache was equipped with advanced sensors and electronic warfare systems that could intercept communications and track vehicle movements through terrain that was impossible to monitor from space. What the mission briefing hadn't mentioned was that recent intelligence suggested a major arms deal was taking place in the corridor, Syrian weapons being sold to Chinese buyers, with the transaction being facilitated by Pakistani middlemen and protected by mercenary pilots flying surplus Soviet aircraft. The kind of operation that could shift the balance of power throughout the region if the weapons reached their intended destinations. Addison had been flying a systematic search pattern for 3 hours when her radar warning receiver began detecting intermittent contacts at the extreme edge of her aircraft's sensor range. The contacts were fast-moving, high-altitude, and following flight patterns that suggested military aircraft rather than civilian traffic. More concerning, they were maintaining radio silence and flying routes that avoided known air traffic control zones. The first clear radar contact appeared at 0847 hours, approximately 40 miles northeast of Addison's position. A single aircraft moving at high speed and low altitude through a valley system that intelligence had identified as a potential smuggling route. Addison adjusted her flight path to investigate while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid detection by the unknown aircraft sensors. What she found changed everything about her understanding of the threat level in the Wakhan Corridor. Through her Apache's advanced optics, Addison identified the contact as a MiG-29 Fulcrum, a twin-engine supersonic fighter jet originally designed by the Soviet Union for air superiority missions. The aircraft was painted in non-standard colors that suggested mercenary or private military operations rather than official government forces. More troubling, it was flying in formation with two other MiG-29s that had somehow avoided detection until they were within visual range. The three fighter jets were conducting what appeared to be combat air patrol, a systematic search pattern designed to detect and intercept any aircraft operating in their designated area. They were armed with air-to-air missiles and moving with the kind of coordinated precision that indicated experienced pilots and professional military training. Addison immediately began transmitting her findings to higher command while simultaneously assessing her tactical options. The Apache's stealth characteristics and low-altitude flight profile had allowed her to observe the enemy formation without being detected, but that advantage would disappear the moment she tried to leave the area or transmit detailed intelligence about what she'd discovered. Her radio call to base was answered by Colonel James Mitchell, the operations commander who'd briefed her mission. Viper Command, understand you have enemy air contacts in your area. What's your assessment? Command Viper, 3 MiG-29 fighters conducting CAP over the primary target area. They're armed and appear to be protecting something on the ground. Request instructions for disengagement and intelligence transmission. There was a pause before Mitchell responded, and Addison could hear multiple voices conferring in the background. Viper Command, you are ordered to maintain observation and gather additional intelligence. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Reinforcements are en route, but ETA is 2 hours minimum. Addison acknowledged the order while mentally calculating the tactical challenges involved in maintaining surveillance of 3 fighter jets while flying a helicopter that would be completely outmatched in any direct confrontation. The Apache's maximum speed was 227 miles per hour, while the MiG-29s could exceed 1,500 miles per hour. If they detected her presence, escape would be impossible. For 30 minutes, Addison maintained a careful balance between observation and concealment, using the mountainous terrain to mask her position while tracking the enemy formation's movements. The MiGs were flying a precise pattern that suggested they were protecting a specific location, most likely a landing zone where the arms transaction was taking place. That's when her luck ran out. At 09:23 hours, Addison's radar warning receiver exploded into activity as all 3 MiG-29s simultaneously turned toward her position and began accelerating. Somehow, despite her stealth precautions and terrain masking, they had detected her presence and were now vectoring for an intercept with the kind of aggressive maneuvering that indicated hostile intent. Command Viper, I'm being painted by enemy radar. 3 MiG-29s inbound hot, distance 15 miles, and closing fast. Colonel Mitchell's response carried the urgency of someone who understood the tactical impossibility of the situation. Viper, command, evade immediately. Use terrain masking and proceed to emergency extraction point Delta. But Addison was already analyzing the geometry of the engagement and realizing that conventional evasion tactics wouldn't work against supersonic fighters in mountainous terrain. The MiGs could climb above the peaks and attack from multiple angles simultaneously, and their speed advantage made escape impossible, even if she had a clear route to friendly territory. The lead MiG achieved missile lock at a distance of 8 miles. Standard Apache doctrine for this situation was simple. There wasn't any. Attack helicopters weren't supposed to engage fighter jets because the outcome was predetermined. Helicopters died, fighters won, end of engagement. But Addison Scott had never been much for following standard doctrine when survival required creative alternatives. As the radar warning tone indicated incoming missile launch, Addison did something that would have gotten her court-martialed in a training exercise. She turned toward the attacking formation and armed her Apache's air-to-air weapon systems. The AH-64 Apache wasn't officially equipped for air-to-air combat, but Addison's aircraft was part of a classified testing program that had been experimenting with enhanced defensive capabilities. Hidden among her standard Hellfire missiles were 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, weapons that were normally carried by fighter jets but had been modified for helicopter launch systems. More importantly, Addison had spent hundreds of hours in classified training programs learning how to use these weapons in scenarios that the military establishment considered theoretical at best. She was one of only 6 pilots in the world who'd been trained to engage fighter aircraft from a helicopter platform. The first MiG's R-73 air-to-air missile streaked toward her position at Mach 2.5, its infrared seeker locked onto her Apache's engine signature. Standard defensive tactics called for deploying chaff and flares while taking evasive action, but Addison knew that conventional countermeasures wouldn't work against a missile designed to defeat much faster and more maneuverable targets. Instead, she did something that violated every principle of helicopter flight safety. She pulled the Apache into a vertical climb that pushed the aircraft beyond its design limitations while simultaneously launching one of her Sidewinder missiles at the incoming R-73. The 2 missiles met in midair at a combined closing speed of over 3,000 miles per hour, creating an explosion that lit up the sky like a small sun. Debris rained down on the mountainous terrain below while Addison fought to control her Apache through the shockwave and turbulence. "Command, Viper! Splash 1 inbound missile. I am engaging enemy fighters with experimental air-to-air systems." Colonel Mitchell's response was immediate and emphatic. "Viper, you are not authorized to engage fighter aircraft. Disengage immediately." But disengagement was no longer an option. The 3 MiG-29s had spread into a coordinated attack formation that would allow them to engage her from multiple angles simultaneously. Their pilots had clearly not expected their target to shoot down their missile, and they were now approaching with the kind of aggressive tactics reserved for high-threat environments. Addison armed her remaining Sidewinder and prepared to prove that sometimes the most effective defense was an offense that nobody expected. The second MiG pilot made the mistake of assuming that his target would behave like a normal helicopter, slow, predictable, and defensively oriented. He approached from a high angle, intending to use his superior speed and altitude to achieve an easy kill shot with his 30mm cannon. What he encountered instead was an Apache helicopter that was maneuvering like a fighter jet. Addison had learned from her father that aerial combat was fundamentally about energy management, altitude and air speed converted into position and timing. The MiG pilot had altitude and speed, but he'd traded away his positional advantage by assuming his target would be predictable. As the MiG dove toward her position, Addison performed a maneuver that should have been impossible in a helicopter. She rolled inverted and pulled through a split S that brought her nose to nose with the attacking fighter at a range where her 30mm chain gun would be devastatingly effective. The engagement lasted 3 seconds. Addison's chain gun fired 150 rounds of high-explosive ammunition into the MiG's cockpit and engine section at point-blank range. The fighter jet disintegrated in a fireball that forced Addison to take violent evasive action to avoid flying through the debris field. "Command, Viper! Splash 1 MiG-29. 2 remaining fighters still engaged." The destruction of their wingman had clearly shocked the remaining MiG pilots, who were now approaching with much more caution and respect for their opponent's capabilities. They split up to attack from different directions, forcing Addison to defend against multiple threats simultaneously. The third MiG attempted a beam attack, approaching from the side to minimize Addison's ability to return fire while maximizing his own weapons engagement envelope. It was a textbook fighter versus fighter tactic that should have been devastating against a helicopter target. But Addison had been trained by the best fighter pilot in Navy history, and she knew that textbook tactics only worked against predictable opponents. As the MiG closed to weapons range, Addison performed a maneuver that her father had taught her, but that she'd never attempted in actual combat. A defensive spiral that used the Apache's superior turning radius to reverse the engagement geometry while maintaining sufficient energy to counterattack. The MiG pilot found himself trying to track a target that was turning inside his aircraft's capabilities while simultaneously climbing and accelerating in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His cannon shots went wide as Addison's Apache danced through the sky like a mechanical hummingbird. When Addison completed her defensive spiral, She was in perfect position to launch her remaining Sidewinder missile at a range where the MiG pilot had no time to deploy countermeasures or take evasive action. The Sidewinder's infrared seeker locked onto the MiG's twin-engine exhausts and guided the missile directly into the fighter's center section. The explosion broke the aircraft in half and sent burning wreckage tumbling toward the mountains below. "Command, Viper! Splash 2! One remaining fighter!" But the final MiG pilot was clearly the most experienced of the three, and he'd learned from watching his wingmen die. Instead of closing for direct engagement, he was maintaining distance while trying to achieve a missile lock that would allow him to attack from beyond the range of Addison's defensive systems. The engagement had now lasted over 6 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat, and Addison's Apache was beginning to show the stress of maneuvering far beyond its design limitations. Warning lights indicated engine overtemperature, hydraulic pressure fluctuations, and rotor system stress that could lead to catastrophic failure if pushed much further. But the final MiG was positioning for a shot that would end the engagement, and Addison realized that conventional defensive tactics wouldn't work against a pilot who'd learned to respect her capabilities. That's when she remembered something her father had taught her about the psychology of aerial combat. Sometimes the most effective tactic was the one that nobody expected, because it appeared to be completely insane. As the MiG achieved missile lock and prepared to fire, Addison did something that violated every principle of aerial survival. She flew directly toward the enemy fighter at maximum speed while descending toward the mountain peaks. The MiG pilot was faced with an impossible choice: fire his missile at a target that was rapidly closing the distance and might be able to engage him with cannon fire, or hold his fire and risk losing his positional advantage. He chose to fire. The R-73 missile launched from the MiG's wing pylon and streaked toward Addison's Apache with deadly precision. But Addison had timed her maneuver perfectly. She was close enough to the mountain peaks to use terrain masking while maintaining sufficient speed to execute the most dangerous maneuver in her repertoire. She flew directly into a narrow canyon at maximum speed while the missile tracked behind her. The canyon walls were less than 200 feet apart, and any error in navigation would result in immediate death. But Addison had studied this terrain during her mission planning, and she knew exactly where the canyon led. The MiG pilot, watching his missile chase the Apache into terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, made the fatal mistake of following his target into the canyon to verify the kill. Addison emerged from the far end of the canyon and immediately pulled into a vertical climb that brought her above the MiG's altitude. The enemy pilot, trapped in the narrow canyon and committed to his flight path, was unable to maneuver effectively when Addison rolled inverted and dove back toward his position. The final engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. Addison's 30mm chain gun fired every remaining round in her ammunition magazine into the MiG's cockpit and wing root at a range where missing was impossible. The fighter jet exploded against the canyon wall, sending a fireball climbing toward the sky. "Command, Viper! Splash 3! All enemy fighters destroyed. I am Winchester and returning to base." The silence that followed her transmission lasted nearly 30 seconds before Colonel Mitchell's voice returned, carrying a mixture of disbelief and professional respect that Addison would remember for the rest of her career. "Viper Command, confirm you engaged and destroyed 3 MiG-29 fighters in air-to-air combat using an Apache helicopter." "Affirmative, Command. 3 confirmed kills with gun and missile systems. Aircraft sustained minor damage but remains flyable. Requesting clearance to RTB." The flight back to base gave Addison time to process what had just happened and to realize that she'd accomplished something that military aviation experts would have considered impossible. An attack helicopter engaging fighter jets in air-to-air combat was supposed to be suicide, but she'd not only survived the encounter, she'd achieved a perfect kill ratio. More importantly, her actions had prevented the enemy fighters from protecting whatever operation they'd been conducting in the Wakhan Corridor. Follow-up intelligence missions would reveal that her engagement had disrupted a major arms deal involving advanced surface-to-air missiles that could have been used to shoot down civilian airliners. The debriefing at Bagram Airfield lasted 8 hours and involved representatives from every branch of the military, along with intelligence analysts who wanted to understand exactly how an Apache helicopter had defeated 3 supersonic fighters. Addison's gun camera footage was analyzed frame by frame, her tactical decisions were scrutinized by aviation experts, and her aircraft was thoroughly inspected to understand how it had survived maneuvers that should have resulted in structural failure. "Captain Scott," said General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer who'd flown in specifically for the debriefing, "what you accomplished today will be studied in military academies for decades. You've proven that unconventional tactics and exceptional pilot skill can overcome seemingly impossible odds." Colonel Mitchell, who'd initially ordered her not to engage the enemy fighters, was more direct in his assessment. "Captain, you violated standing orders, exceeded your aircraft's design limitations, and engaged in combat that could have resulted in the loss of a classified aircraft and the death of one of our most experienced pilots." He paused, his expression shifting from criticism to respect. "You also prevented a major arms transfer that could have resulted in terrorist attacks against civilian targets, and you demonstrated combat capabilities that will fundamentally change how we think about helicopter operations in contested airspace." The technical analysis of Addison's engagement revealed tactical innovations that military aviation experts had never considered. Her use of terrain masking, energy management, and three-dimensional maneuvering had allowed her to engage fighter jets on nearly equal terms, despite overwhelming disadvantages in speed and altitude performance. More significantly, her success had demonstrated that the experimental air-to-air weapon systems being tested on Apache helicopters were viable for operational use. The program that had equipped her aircraft with Sidewinder missiles was immediately expanded, and new training protocols were developed for helicopter pilots who might face similar situations. "The implications of this engagement extend far beyond individual pilot skill," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, an aerospace engineer who'd been analyzing the gun camera footage. "Captain Scott has proven that properly equipped and trained helicopter pilots can defend themselves against fighter aircraft under specific circumstances." "What specific circumstances?" asked General Hayes. "Terrain that limits the fighter's speed and maneuverability advantages, pilots with advanced training in three-dimensional combat tactics, and aircraft equipped with appropriate weapon systems, Dr. Chen replied. Captain Scott had all 3 factors working in her favor, plus exceptional skill and situational awareness. The broader implications of Addison's success were immediately recognized by military planners, who understood that air superiority could no longer be assumed in conflicts involving well-equipped adversaries. If attack helicopters could defend themselves against fighter jets, it would fundamentally change tactical planning for ground support operations in contested environments. 6 months later, Captain Addison Scott found herself at the Army Aviation Center of Excellence at Fort Rucker, Alabama, where she'd been assigned to develop and teach new air-to-air combat techniques for helicopter pilots. Her success in the Wakhan Corridor had made her the military's leading expert on helicopter air-to-air engagements, despite the fact that such engagements were supposed to be impossible. The training program she developed was classified at the highest levels and restricted to pilots with exceptional skill ratings and psychological evaluations. The techniques she taught were based on her father's fighter pilot training combined with the unique characteristics of rotary wing aircraft, creating a new form of aerial combat that military historians would later describe as revolutionary. The key to surviving fighter engagement in a helicopter, Addison explained to her first class of students, is understanding that your disadvantages can become advantages if you force the fight into an environment where your strengths matter more than their speed. Her students were handpicked from the most experienced Apache, Cobra, and Black Hawk pilots in the military. All had extensive combat experience, but none had ever considered the possibility of engaging fighter aircraft until they watched gun camera footage of Addison's engagement in the Wakhan Corridor. "Ma'am," asked Captain Jennifer Walsh, a Black Hawk pilot with 4 combat deployments. How do we overcome the speed differential when fighters can engage us from beyond our weapons range? Addison smiled, remembering her father's voice during countless training sessions. The same way David beat Goliath, by changing the rules of engagement. Fighters are designed to fight other fighters in open airspace. When you force them into terrain that limits their advantages, you can create opportunities that don't exist in conventional air-to-air combat. The training program included simulator sessions that recreated the tactical challenges Addison had faced, allowing pilots to practice maneuvers and techniques that would have been too dangerous to attempt in actual aircraft. The simulators were programmed with engagement scenarios based on real-world threats, giving pilots experience with tactical situations they might face in combat. More importantly, the program included psychological training designed to help pilots overcome the instinctive fear that came with engaging aircraft designed to kill them. The mental discipline required to attack a fighter jet while flying a helicopter required the kind of courage that could only be developed through extensive preparation and training. Fear is your enemy in this kind of engagement, Addison told her students. The moment you start thinking about how outmatched you are, you've already lost. You have to believe that your training and your aircraft's capabilities are sufficient to win, even when logic suggests otherwise. The program's first graduates were deployed to combat zones where they encountered various threats, but no direct fighter engagements. However, their enhanced training in three-dimensional combat tactics proved valuable in conventional helicopter operations, leading to improved survival rates and mission effectiveness. 2 years after her engagement in the Wakhan Corridor, Major Addison Scott received orders that would take her full circle. She was being assigned to a classified program developing next-generation attack helicopters with enhanced air-to-air capabilities. Her combat experience and training expertise made her the ideal candidate to help design aircraft that could defend themselves in contested airspace. The program, designated Project Valkyrie, was developing helicopters that combined the ground attack capabilities of traditional attack helicopters with air-to-air systems that would allow them to engage fighter aircraft on more equal terms. Advanced sensors, stealth technology, and weapon systems specifically designed for helicopter versus fighter engagements were being integrated into aircraft that would represent the next evolution of rotary wing warfare. "Major Scott," said Dr. Robert Kim, the program's technical director, "your combat experience gives us insight into capabilities that no amount of theoretical analysis could provide. We're designing aircraft that will allow helicopter pilots to do routinely what you accomplished through exceptional skill and favorable circumstances." Addison's role in the program involved everything from weapon systems testing to pilot interface design. Her understanding of the split-second decision-making required in aerial combat helped engineers develop systems that could provide critical information without overwhelming pilots during high-stress engagements. The first prototype aircraft incorporated lessons learned from her Wakhan Corridor engagement, including enhanced maneuverability systems, advanced threat detection, and weapons that could engage targets at ranges previously impossible for helicopters. Test flights demonstrated capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. "The aircraft you're helping us develop will change the nature of aerial warfare, Doctor," Kim explained during one of their technical reviews. "Helicopters will no longer be vulnerable to fighter interdiction, which means ground forces will have close air support available even in contested airspace." But Addison understood that technology alone wouldn't determine the outcome of aerial engagements. The human factor, pilot skill, training, and the mental discipline to execute complex maneuvers under extreme stress would always be the deciding factor in combat. "The best aircraft in the world won't help if the pilot isn't properly trained," she reminded the engineering team. "What I did in the Wakhan Corridor was possible because of years of preparation and training that began long before I ever climbed into that Apache." 5 years after her legendary engagement, Colonel Addison Scott commanded the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment's most classified unit, responsible for operations that required capabilities no other helicopter force in the world possessed. Her pilots were trained to engage any threat in any environment, from conventional ground targets to fighter aircraft operating in contested airspace. The techniques she'd developed had been refined and expanded into a comprehensive doctrine that was being adopted by allied nations facing similar threats. Australian, British, and Israeli helicopter pilots were training at Fort Rucker to learn air-to-air engagement techniques that had proven their effectiveness in conflicts around the world. What you started in the Wakhan Corridor has become a revolution in how we think about helicopter operations, General Hayes told Addison during a ceremony recognizing her contributions to military aviation. You've proven that innovation and courage can overcome technological disadvantages when lives are on the line. Addison's legacy extended beyond her personal achievements to encompass fundamental changes in military doctrine and aircraft design. The impossible had become routine, and helicopter pilots no longer considered fighter aircraft to be invulnerable opponents. On quiet evenings at Fort Rucker, Addison would sometimes stand on the flight line and watch her pilots practicing maneuvers that had been born from desperation in the skies over the Wakhan Corridor. Each successful training flight was proof that courage and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Her father would have been proud to see how his daughter had taken the lessons he'd taught her and used them to save not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from the training and tactics she'd developed. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not for territory or resources, but for the principle that determination and skill could triumph over superior technology. The woman who'd once been considered crazy for attacking fighter jets with a helicopter had become the architect of a new form of warfare that proved the most dangerous opponent was always the one who refused to accept that defeat was inevitable. In the skies over training ranges around the world, helicopter pilots were learning that sometimes the best defense was an attack that nobody expected, and that courage combined with skill could rewrite the rules of engagement even against impossible odds. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.